Thank you for that. I now want to go actually off the script, but I want to welcome someone who was just referenced earlier and welcome our Congressman G.K. Butterfield up to the podium to say a few words.
Very good. Hey, how are you? Good evening. First of all, let me just recognize the chair of this auspicious occasion this evening, the Reverend Benjamin Kane. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you to all of those who have worked with him to make this evening possible. I've been going to dinners and banquets all of my life, and I know for sure that events like this just don't happen. It happens because a lot of good people come together and make it happen. And so thank you to the committee for this 28th annual commemorative banquet. I'm honored to be here. To the head table guests here assembled and to our distinguished speaker, Mr. Joyner, thank you for those very enlightening words. I'm very proud of you. You have said what needed to be said on an occasion such as this. To the elected officials in the audience, and I'm just beginning to scan the audience and see that there are many electeds here tonight, thank you for your leadership, not only here in Edgecombe County, but throughout Eastern North Carolina. And I see my senator down there, Erica Smith. Thank you for your incredible leadership in the state Senate. And yes. And my good friend, Representative Shelley Willingham, who represents Martin and Edgecombe County. And then to the award recipients, thank you for the contributions that you've made. You're very deserving of these honors tonight, and I just congratulate each one of you, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just very briefly thank you for allowing me to come in and say a few words this evening. I have 13 MLK events on my calendar this weekend. This is number 3. I started off in Greenville last night at the General Baptist State Convention. They had 800 or so good Baptists over there last night. I just left Warrenton a few moments ago, and I don't know if the sheriff is here tonight, but we drove the speed limit. We got here just a few minutes ago, and so thank you. I'm sorry I came in late, but thank you for accommodating my schedule. Let me just thank you in Edgecombe County for all the work that you do. Edgecombe County stands out. I don't know if you recognize that because you are here and you are just working every day, but the great work that you do in Edgecombe County really is a model for the state, and it's well recognized, and I thank you so very much. I have the honor of representing each one of you in the House of Representatives. I've done that now for the last 14 years. It doesn't seem that long, but thank you for the privilege to be able to serve you. Let me just talk briefly, and then I'll take my seat, about Martin Luther King, Jr. I give these MLK speeches, and it won't be a speech tonight, it would just be a few pointers, but I give MLK speeches all across North Carolina, all across the country, and I've done this now for 30 or more years. An incredible man. What a lot of people don't get, especially young people, about Martin Luther King, Jr., is that he started his public service at age 26, and it ended abruptly at age 39. Martin Luther King didn't spend 40 or 50 years out on the battlefield like some of you in this audience. 13 years in public service. He started his effort down in Montgomery, Alabama. He was sent to a church in Montgomery to be the pastor. He was new in town. The community was upset because African Americans had to be segregated by race on public transportation there in Montgomery. And so they organized what was called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And then all of a sudden they realized, well, every movement needs a leader. Who's going to do it? And then the old preacher in the audience, Roy Gray, I think his name was. Excuse me, Roy. I meant to say Richard Joyner. But the old preacher in the audience said, there's a new man in town. named Martin Luther King Jr. He's from over there in Atlanta. His daddy was a preacher, is a preacher. I think he ought to be the one to lead this bus boycott. They called in King, and King graciously accepted the challenge. And for the next 13 months in Montgomery, Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others led that phenomenal movement and demanded that the bus system in that city in the South be desegregated. And after 13 months of boycotting the buses, they were successful. And that then gave energy to a civil rights movement, and Dr. King was given so much of the credit for leading the movement. And then 1960 comes along. John F. Kennedy is running for president. John F. Kennedy goes to African Americans who live in the North, who were registered voters, and to the few African Americans in the South who were registered to vote, and said, look, please vote for me. A lot of people don't want me because I'm a Catholic, I'm from the New England part of the country. A lot of people don't want a Catholic as president, but I need the black vote in order to get elected. And then the African American community embraced John F. Kennedy, and he became president. And he promised African Americans that if he were elected to the presidency, that he would try to oversee a civil rights bill. And the African American community believed him. He was sworn in January 20th, 1961. Nothing happened. 1962 came and went. Nothing happened. And by the beginning of 1963, African American leaders, Dr. King in particular, was very upset with John Kennedy because he had betrayed them. And he had not done what he had promised he would do. And Dr. King and others went to President Kennedy and said, President Kennedy, we supported you as best we could. We supported you. We helped you get elected, and now you have turned your back on us. And President Kennedy said, but you don't understand. I've got a fool down there in Cuba named Fidel Castro, and I'm having to deal with him. I'm trying to put a man on the moon in the next 10 years, and we're trying to do a moonshot in this country. I'm trying to bring in some other programs that will help your people, low-income people all across the country. We cannot do a civil rights bill right now. And Dr. King became very discouraged and went back and planned the 1963 March on Washington. He called black and white and brown people from all across the country to come to Washington for a massive demonstration on the National Mall. August 28, 1963, I was there. 16 years old, Reverend Hines, with my father. He made me get in the car. We went to Washington and participated in that historic march. But that march was all about demanding that President Kennedy change his mind and pass a civil rights bill. And just as King was preparing and organizing the march, Kennedy became very upset and called them to the White House and said, look, you got my attention, but if we're going to get a civil rights bill, we cannot have 250,000 people out here demonstrating. It would turn off the Congress. So call off the march and we will get it done. And King went back to Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and all of the other leaders of labor and other groups that were planning the march and said, look, we got a dilemma. If we go on with the march and Congress gets turned off and they won't pass a bill, or if we call off the march and they don't do it, then our community is going to turn against us. What do we do? And Dr. King said, the right thing to do is to continue with the march. They had the march. It was very successful, and you know that story, the We Shall Overcome story. And 5 weeks later, 4 little girls were bombed in Birmingham, Alabama, 16th Street Baptist Church. They were murdered on a Sunday morning as they were coming up the steps for the morning service. And by that time, President Kennedy was embarrassed. He was embarrassed because he had turned his back on the African American community. And finally, he said, we're going to have a civil rights bill. And he announced to the nation that he would support a civil rights bill. A few days went by. President Kennedy went to Dallas, Texas, got in the back seat of a Cadillac convertible, in a motorcade through that city. And the next thing we knew, his head was blown off. And President Kennedy was assassinated. After Kennedy's death, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became the president. Lyndon Johnson, some of you young people, you're hearing this for the first time, right? Lyndon Johnson becomes president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson calls in Dr. King and said, "King, I know you are disappointed that Kennedy did not move fast enough. But I'm from the South, and I understand what you're saying. We're going to do a civil rights bill." And that's when President Johnson embraced the idea of civil rights. He went to the senators that he had served with in the United States Senate and beat them up and down until they passed a civil rights bill. And so in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was enacted into law. The Civil Rights Bill was about public accommodations. What are public accommodations? Bus stations, train stations, restaurants, hotels, motels. Those are public accommodations. The Civil Rights Bill was not about voting. It was about civil rights and public accommodations. King was so appreciated, not just here in America, but all across the world for his great work. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize. He went to Oslo, Norway, and got the award, very distinguished award. Gave the money away, incidentally. But he came back to America. President Johnson summoned him to the White House. King went to the White House, and the president said to him, "Dr. King, on behalf of a grateful nation, on behalf of President John Kennedy, who is no longer with us, on behalf of all good-thinking Americans, we thank you for your work on civil rights. I know that people were murdered in the streets. I know that there were a lot of sacrifices made in this movement, but we now have a civil rights bill." Dr. King very pointedly said, "Thank you, Mr. President. Now, sir, we need a voting rights bill." President Johnson said, "No, you didn't go there with me, did you?" And Dr. King says, "Yes, sir, we need a voting rights bill." Why do we need a voting rights bill right now, Dr. King? We need a voting rights bill because down in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, they used to have a black congressman in Tarboro named George H. White. He had to get kicked out of politics because they took away the right to vote from African Americans. They created a literacy test in the South where you had to be able to read and write and prove that you were literate in order to vote. All of those things happened in 1900, not just in North Carolina, but all across the South. We need a Voting Rights Act that would now restore the right to vote for African Americans in the South. President Johnson said, "Well, you know, I'm from Texas, and I know what you're talking about. But you must understand, I am a new president. I took over after President Kennedy was assassinated. I want to be a two-term president. I've got a war waging in Vietnam right now, and people are breathing down my throat. Just give me some patience. Give me some time, and we can have a Voting Rights Act." Dr. King says, "No, now is the time.
Right now,
President, we must have a Voting Rights Act." President Johnson stood up with his lanky self. He was a tall man, and said, "Dr. King, I'm sorry." King stood up in the Oval Office, walked to the door, and as he approached the door, John Lewis has told me this story so many times, I know it's true. He said when King got to the door, President Johnson stopped him and winked his eye and said, "Make me do it. Make me do it." He said that in a positive way, not in a negative way.
Right.
Make me do it. King left the White House, went to Atlanta for Christmas, January of 1965. King started a brand new movement, Selma to Montgomery. Went to Selma, Alabama. Miss Boynton invited him to Selma to lead a brand new movement, Selma to Montgomery. That's where he went and organized hundreds and thousands of people to march from Selma to Montgomery. When they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you've read that story, that was Bloody Sunday, and the march was unsuccessful because of the violence of police officers. Police officers were violent, troopers, deputy sheriffs, hey sheriff, deputy sheriffs, police officers. Bloody Sunday, they turned them back. 2 or 3 weeks later, the marchers came back again. By the time they reached Selma, Montgomery, they had 250,000 people demanding a voting rights law. I'm closing. As the drivers of the cars were shuttling the marchers back to Selma, a white woman who had come down from Detroit named Viola Louisia was run off the road, and she was murdered trying to get some of the marchers back to Selma. And once she was murdered, that's when President Johnson threw up his hands and said, "I surrender." Went on national TV March 15, 1965, and said to the nation, we're going to have a Voting Rights Act because Viola Louisia's death and the deaths of others shall not be in vain.
All right now.
And because of that historic movement, the Voting Rights Act was introduced into law, bill was introduced into the Congress, and on August 6th of 1965, a second landmark piece of legislation called the Voting Rights Act was enacted into law. Because of the Voting Rights Act, we now have made huge progress. Don't you think that these good people would be in the state legislature without a Voting Rights Act? Would not happen. Don't you think Carol Allen White would be the clerk of court for Edgecombe County?
Come on now.
Were it not for a Voting
All
Rights
right
Act? And while I'm talking about Violas, let me talk about my other Viola,
All right
County
now.
Commissioner, Viola Harris. Don't you think she wouldn't be a county, and there are others as well. The Voting Rights Act has made a profound difference. And so it's now 2018, and we've got to maintain the spirit and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. We've got to continue to struggle because we have some mountains to climb
Yes, sir.
before we can really say that we have reached the promised land.
All right.
Thank you very much. God bless you.